SYS presents Adventures in Online Education.
Welcome back to Season 2 of Adventures in Online Education. I am really excited for you to meet my first guest of the season. Her name is Jodi Miller. She is really intelligent, very wise, and very humble and kind as well. She is a former high school biology teacher and current PhD student at the Johns Hopkins University School of Education. Jodi also created WellCheq, WellCheq. She is really passionate about rethinking the way that schools support students. Her research focuses on how stress affects the brains and bodies of learners and how it is related to achievement. She also examines how schools can serve as a buffer for students who may be experiencing a lot of stress and trauma. So today we talk about social emotional learning. We talk about how to support ourselves and how to support our students and the impacts of that. I think you're really going to love getting to meet Jodi, and I can't wait for you to hear this episode. So, are you ready? Let's learn something new. Welcome, Jodi Miller. Thank you so much for being our first guest of Season 2 of Adventures in Online Education.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yay! I'm excited to have you here. I'm really excited to talk about social emotional learning today and students' well-being and teachers' well-being. But before we dive into all of that, it's August and it's that time where we're transitioning to fall, transitioning back into a school year. How does that feel for you? What does that look like for you this year?
It's super exciting because in like the WellCheq world, which we'll get to later, we're trying to build and grow, but I'm also I'm a PhD student and I'm hoping to defend my proposal this fall, hopefully September. So It's a lot of work. So I feel like I have a lot to do between now and like mid-September. So I definitely have that like little anxious end of summer, a lot of work feeling.
Yes. Oh, I totally feel that. The end of summer is always a mix of emotions. And congratulations on your PhD and starting that whole process. And that is huge. And we need more people like you doing that. So
Thank you.
yeah, but it is such a mix, isn't it?
Such a mix. And it's funny because I love the fall but I also remember, because I was a teacher, I also remember there's like a part of you that feels like, oh, my life is ending. And it's not, but like to go from the flexibility and the freedom of summer back to like the more structured routine of fall is definitely a transition.
Absolutely. I still have the same recurring dream that even though I've been in the online world for a long time, that I'm going physically to a school and I don't have my shoes on. I always have that dream this time of year. And I just think it's one of those signs like, okay, it's ending and I need to get prepared.
Oh, totally. My stress dream is that I lose my teeth. There's really no reason for this. It's completely irrational, but I like wake up and I check every single tooth. I like look in the mirror and they're there. I always ask my dentist, like, my teeth are not going to fall out, right? And they're like, no, you're fine.
I love it. Well, speaking of stress, speaking of our own well-being, that's what we're talking about today. There are absolutely a few phrases that have been circulating more widely in the education world in the last year or more. And one of them is SEL, or social emotional learning. And a couple of others, somewhat related, are growth mindset and mindfulness. Is social emotional learning, is SEL, related to mindfulness or growth mindset? And why do teachers need to know about any of this? Some listeners may be wondering why educators should prioritize SEL in their classrooms when they're having their stress dreams and they've got a lot on their plates, including the return of state testing or teacher evaluations. And as always, there's a myriad of new interventions or initiatives in the fall. How should they prioritize it and why should they?
Yeah. So I totally empathize because I taught high school bio and we were a tested subject. So I felt a huge amount of pressure to fit in the curriculum and to meet all the standards. And in my 3 years, I don't think we ever finished. We got really close as I got a little bit more experienced. So I know that pressure. And I think how I view social emotional learning is it's many different kind of aspects and things. And so there are different kind of buckets and categories. And I know Castle has the 5 major kind of constructs. And really what I think about on one hand is how students are doing and emotionally and helping them feel supported. To me, that's part of social emotional learning. And then also helping students develop their emotional regulation toolbox and providing them with strategies. And I think in some ways, those two parts can actually be, I view them as an investment that really pays off down the line. And that my experience when I had those strong rapport and relationships with students, everything else fell into place and was a little bit easier. I was able to kind of support them academically better and help motivate them when they were having off days. We had fewer kind of classroom disruptions and challenges to our learning process. And also it was so much more fun. When I knew them and we had these relationships, it just made everything better. And so while there are so many different constraints, I think it is this really worthwhile investment when you build that relationship with students and they feel supported. And you're also in the process helping them develop their own kind of regulation toolbox. And social emotional learning can also be about communication and problem solving. So there are lots of different components, and finding ways to kind of even subtly bring them into your curriculum or your practices can be really helpful, both academically, but also just helping our students grow and develop.
This makes me really think of how sometimes people lament that schools have so much responsibility for teaching kids life skills outside of academic skills. And it's really true, right? But we're social beings and we don't exist in isolation from one another. We experienced how damaging that can be during lockdown for sure. So it's important for us to help kids develop these new skills because even if parents do the work too, applying it in a school setting is a whole new story. And how we act and react around our siblings, for instance, or our parents isn't necessarily how we behave in school. And so learning some of that hidden curriculum and those social rules, I think that's really important, as well as how to take care of ourselves, how to emotionally and mentally deal with someone who acts outside of the norm for us. So broadening our scope beyond how my family or my neighborhood works, even. And what about mindfulness and growth mindset?
So I also think of mindfulness as part of social emotional learning. And I never really learned how to implement it when I was teaching. And I've learned about it since I've been a student again. And it's really cool. It's about kind of taking inventory of where we are, how are we feeling, what do I feel in parts of my body? Is something bothering us? And if it is, like, what is it? And or like what might we need? And I think it's a really great skill to develop within ourselves as teachers, but also in students. I remember there were times when things were chaotic or I was dealing with a situation and I really needed to pause and think about what is the best way to handle this situation. And so to me, mindfulness is about giving yourself that opportunity to pause and reflect, even if it's very quickly, on how am I, what do I need, what's the best way to move forward. And I think it can be done in a lot of ways. One thing I feel like with mindfulness and social emotional learning is we tend to think of mindfulness as having to be a quiet moment, which can feel intimidating for teachers in a class of 30 plus students. But there are really cool ways to teach mindfulness that don't necessarily kind of require what we almost think of as meditation. So having mindful conversations, teaching students how to listen, to understand rather than to respond, which is something we're all always working on, I imagine. And so I think mindfulness is a really cool understanding and practice to try to bring to ourselves as teachers, but also to students. And it can be very subtle. As far as growth mindset, I think sometimes it comes under fire and can be tricky, but to me, the most important message is not yet. So students may be frustrated or struggling or feel like they're not where they want to be, and just reaffirming that you might not be there yet. It doesn't mean you're never going to get there. It's with practice and asking for help and thinking about what you might need to reach your goal. it's not that the goal's impossible necessarily. It's just how do we build there and giving them this sense of hope and motivation and recognizing that lots of things just take a lot of practice.
Yeah, and they are hard, and we can do hard things, but it's hard. It's a challenge, and I think for
Yeah.
adults alike, growth mindset can feel like a challenge, almost that we don't always wanna take on, or we wanna just be where we're at, and so it's hard for us sometimes to encourage kids to do that when we struggle with it as well, possibly.
I think too, when having that growth mindset for students too, and it's always this careful balance because you want to make sure you're meeting their needs and you're not putting them in a situation where maybe they can't be successful, but also reminding yourself too with students that maybe they're not there yet and figuring out how do you build up to that or how do you meet them where they are and push them forward rather than just, oh, well, maybe they just will never be A or B. And so I think it goes all ways for teachers and ourselves, for students, but also for how we view students. And it can be really hard, but just kind of, I think it's all about messaging, especially for growth mindset. So just reaffirming that you might not be there yet, but we practice and that's how we get better. And look what you've accomplished today versus when we started this in September or October. I think that can be really positive.
Yes, that's so wise. That is so wise. It feels like mindfulness and growth mindset are subsets of SEL and that they're tools we can use to engage in social emotional learning with kids. I like knowing that they can work in conjunction with one another and that they have similar end goals in mind. What about the teachers feeling burned out, though? Is SEL just another thing to add to our list, or is it more?
Such a good issue to think about because I worry about teacher burnout so much. And I know we're going to
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit later, but teacher well being is so crucial. And so, one thing that struck me in some of my research and my own experience is we as humans need this relatedness. We need to connect to other people, whether it's our students or our colleagues. And that really gives us a sense of competence and it helps fuel our motivation and especially for teachers who love connecting with students, I actually think that SEL, when done right, can actually help erode some of that burnout and fill our cups in ways that maybe other things can. So I understand why sometimes it might feel like another added to-do list, but my hope is that it doesn't have to be if it's done in a way that feels organic and natural and ultimately leads to stronger relationships with students because that was what helped me on days when I felt exhausted was those small interactions with students where we were joking around or we had this really nice rapport and that helped fuel my cup and my hope is that SEL practices can also do that for teachers. And I think because SEL encompasses so many things, it doesn't have to look the same in every class and it can be really subtle and it can be integrated into what is being talked about or done. And for example, I remember when I was teaching about mitosis and genetics, we would talk about different like gender identities and how do we interact with people and how do we be empathetic towards people whose situations might be different from ours and the importance of being patient and kind and compassionate towards other people. And so in that small way, that was a little bit of SEL, but it didn't necessarily take over my lesson because I did need to teach mitosis that day.
That is fantastic. I'm just kind of sitting with some of the things you've said so far today. The idea that, mindfulness doesn't have to be a meditation or a silent or really quiet activity, and that SEL is a bucket filler. Because I think sometimes we hear of something new to us or that we're learning or that our school is implementing, and we think in terms of us giving and emptying our buckets, like, okay, we need to do this one more thing. And what you're saying makes so much sense that if we actually do this, it's going to fill our buckets. And that's awesome. And that it can be done in subtle ways that we can integrate it because it's another lens. It's almost like we've talked about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, on the podcast before. And it's almost that same thing. It's not like you do UDL or you do SEL. It's how you're looking at what you're doing and how you're engaging with it. So to have that side conversation about gender nonconforming students, that's fantastic because that is SEL work, but it's such a natural integration with what you're doing. That's
I think
fantastic.
I think that's really important because I know that there are different curricula that exist out there and they're really great. I think sometimes people feel uncomfortable because the curriculum might be asking them to do things that don't feel like them and don't jive with how they interact with students or their personality. And so I think how can you still give students teach students some of the values and skills that you want them to learn in a way that works for you? And I really like finding ways to be flexible and fluid about teaching some of these social emotional kind of learning skills, because I think that's most sustainable and feels best when I can incorporate some of those conversations without derailing my plan. I hopefully can get the benefit of those conversations and also not feel overwhelmed by the crazy pacing and scheduling that is high school science and other subjects.
Absolutely. SYS is an online management company that takes a different approach. We partner with schools to manage solutions. Whether you are a district adding an online option for students or an online school looking to go in a new direction, SYS Education can help make it exactly what you need it to be, with high-quality products at a fraction of the cost that schools pay to other companies. We are not just an educational consulting company, we are online educators ourselves, and a tech team like no other. Let us help you bring your online school experience to the next level. Find out more at syseducation.org or by emailing info@syseducation.org. Set up your free consultation meeting to discuss how SYS might be able to help your school. All right, Jodi, before the break, you have made it really clear why we should be teaching social emotional skills. You have made a great case for that, and I am 110% on board. Humans have feelings, humans have emotions, and we need to express those in healthy ways, and we need to manage them in healthy ways, and in all kinds of situations and with all kinds of people. Those are life skills. And we know that kids need to feel a sense of trust within their classrooms and have a positive relationship with their teacher to learn at their highest potential, and that teachers feel happier when that's the case too. So filling that bucket, again, making everyone feel welcomed. So clearly being able to share how they're doing and what they need emotionally is a good thing. But when you're teaching via Zoom and Canvas or Google Meet, for instance, how does a teacher, fully online teacher, make sure that students are checking in with themselves? And then how can teachers respond in really meaningful ways? Kind of brass tacks, how can it be done online?
So I think this is such an important question, but honestly, also in real life, I remember I would look at my students, and it's so hard to know who is doing okay or maybe not okay. There's this pressure to appear fine, and there's so many students who are struggling silently. So it is even compounded by being behind a screen. But I would say, in general, it's always really hard to know how your students are doing.
Hmm.
And when I was teaching, we had advisory and we would sit in a circle and we would go around and say our number on a scale of 1 through 10. And what I found was that was helpful, but I also was kind of like managing the class, and it was hard for me to just make sure I remembered each number while also kind of monitoring. And in the back of my head, it's like, what do I need to do in my next period? So it was hard for me to focus. And so I also found that students didn't necessarily want to air their business necessarily. So they would just say, I'm a 10, but because they didn't want people to know, which makes sense. I had high schoolers. So what
Mhm.
I did is I created WellCheq, and I'll back up because I saw teachers creating Google Forms and to kind of do these emotional check-ins with students. And that was such a good idea because it allows students to privately express how they're doing, this kind of daily quick check-in. And that's really what WellCheq was. So I started working on it even before the pandemic, around, I guess, in the early stages. So like April, May, June of 2020. And it's really designed to be this simple check-in tool where students respond to how are you feeling, and they select a bunch of emotions. And then also they kind of rate their overall well-being. And the idea is that teachers are flagged if students are of concern or are reporting low well-being. And so some kind of check-in system that's simple and private and easy, I think can be really impactful, because it's really hard for students to look an adult in the eye. And like I said, it's so hard to know how they're doing. So giving them this space, I think, can be really helpful. And then using that data is also super important. And what we've seen teachers do, especially during these virtual times, is pull students into breakout rooms and just have conversations and check in. And seems like you said you're feeling sad. What's going on? How can I support you? Referring them to outside support as needed. So maybe they need some support from the counselor, or the school psychologist, or social worker. And we've also seen other really wonderful ways teachers have used that kind of check-in information, whether it's reaching out to parents in times of real concern, or just facilitating group conversations about different emotions to help students feel seen and cared about.
That is a really great idea, using the breakouts and taking the data to say, "Hey, family, here's a resource for you. I'm happy to connect you." And what you said about us wanting to appear okay really resonated, because I remember that as a student in school as well. And I think sometimes we, as online educators, say like, "Oh, that's so much harder online to do this." And I think you're really right that it's hard to do it in either setting. It's just tough because we, especially at junior high and high school, kids are putting on that front, and we're told to do the same thing as educators, come on in and be ready to teach and bring your best self every day. And we want to do that. We want to model that for students, but we also want to model that we're human too. So I really appreciate that. WellCheq is a digital tool, so online teachers can certainly try it, and it's free. Amazing. Thank you. We can teach online and we can still get that check-in data, which is what we want. And it can be private for the student. And then we decide what to do with it from there. Especially if the data maybe isn't alarming us. Kids in our class or classes seem to be doing all right. What should we do with that data and with our students?
So, one thing I've loved is learning about how teachers are using the data, because it doesn't necessarily need to be a daily conversation. If things kind of seem status quo, that's okay. It's designed to be quick, and it's not designed to kind of take over other parts of the lesson unless you find that your students really need that. But one thing we have is, so we have this emotional bar graph, is what I call it. And what it does is it counts the number of times students selected each emotion, and you can set it for a day or a week, and it's cool and it's colorful. And what I've loved is seeing what teachers do with it, because sometimes they'll show students, like, this is how we are feeling as a class. And students can see, oh, 7 people chose happy today, 6 people chose stressed, 4 people chose sad. And because students can choose more than one emotion, it doesn't line up one to one, and it's anonymous. So you have no idea who selected what. And I love that teachers have shown this to their class, because it allows students to see they're not the only one feeling a certain way, which I think in itself is really cathartic, to know that other people are also feeling lonely or sad or frustrated or stressed, can provide one with comfort and hopefully help them kind of destigmatize their own feelings. So instead of like, why am I feeling this way? Oh, okay, I'm not the only one. And then it also allows students to kind of have conversations about some of these feelings without it feeling inherently personal. So, why might people be feeling tired or sluggish? It's not why I am. It's a lot safer to talk about why one might, or why other people. And then the last thing, which I love teachers have done, is they've showed students this bar graph and said, remember, some of your peers may be feeling sad or lonely or angry, so don't forget to check in with them. And using those opportunities to help students learn about, how do we talk to our friends about our feelings, and how can we be good friends and responsive listeners. And so these are all really subtle, like, messages and actions, but when you do them consistently, they really send a tone of, we care about not just our well-being, but our community well-being, and how do we take care of one another and support one another. And I think also it removes some of the I and allows us to talk about we, and also emotions more generally, which it feels a lot safer.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of building community through these practices and building a sense of us, not just me or not we and them, but us, and taking care of one another. That is a fantastic lesson that we all need to continually learn, I think. Jodi, this has been amazing. Final question of today. We've talked about students' well-being, but what about their teachers' well-being and social emotional skills? Can we teach social emotional skills if we don't have strong ones ourselves? How can we improve on our own emotional intelligence and our own self-awareness so that we can do a really great job for our students?
So, teacher well being is so important for me because when I was a teacher, I watched my own well being be a little bit compromised and that of my peers. And we loved what we were doing. And I loved being a teacher, but it took so much out of me. And I saw similar kind of trends with my peers. And so that's something that I really think about and worry about. And it's also cool because my advisor and I do a lot of research looking at teacher well being. And like we recently finished a study about how compromised teacher well-being was associated with less than optimal outcomes for students.
Oh, that's really interesting. Can you tell us more about that research, about your findings so far?
Yeah, so we were working on a paper that looked at teachers' experiences with depression and their ability to regulate their emotions. And understandably, teachers who are experiencing more symptoms of depression have harder time regulating their emotions and have working towards goals and focusing a little bit more on what's happening in their class. And then what we saw is that students ultimately had slightly lower executive functioning. And it's not a causal relationship. So we can't definitively say teacher depression causes poor outcomes for students.
Right.
But they're associated. And so I think understanding how our teachers' well-being is related to student outcomes is really important because we should just take care of our teachers because we love them and they're doing such important work, full stop. But for the powers that be that need this encouragement, there is a lot of research that shows that taking better care of our teachers really does have better outcomes for students. And more recently, we looked at teacher job satisfaction and how that even 2 years later was associated with student behavior. So there really are long-term
Wow.
effects that teachers have. And to me, it's both positive because that means that as a teacher, you can have really positive long-term effects on students, even if you don't see them right away. And it also just shows the importance of taking care of each and every teacher because they matter. And I think also one thing I wanted to note in all of this is there's no fault in that teachers are working through so many different challenges and it what we're observing as far as the outcomes for students are not at all indicative of teachers' lack of trying. I have seen teachers move the ends of the earth, especially this year, to support students. But we're humans and we have a limited capacity and bandwidth. And so if we're not allowing teachers to fill their cup, then they're pouring from a cup that isn't full. And that affects everything else. So this is no means an indictment on teachers because they're rock stars. They're doing everything they can. It's just how do we take better care of them and how do we create a system that is less likely to promote burnout or emotional exhaustion?
Absolutely. There had been a lot of pushback I saw on Twitter during the pandemic when people were calling teachers heroes and superstars, and they were all like, nope, please stop because I am a human. Please don't hold me to hero, superstar status. I'm not. I'm a human and I have a limit too. And I think that's really important.
It is super important. And then there's something else that you asked about, like how do teachers take care of themselves? And I think that part of it is teachers figuring out their own boundaries and their own kind of coping mechanisms and what works for them, but also thinking about like the system and finding ways to give teachers some autonomy and space to like be themselves in their classroom while still making sure they're meeting the requirements, etc. Also giving that relatedness that I mentioned earlier is so important with students and also colleagues. So giving colleagues space to talk and form relationships and build that trust among themselves as a community is really important because feeling like you're supported goes a long way for helping to buffer against the effects of stress. It doesn't make the stress go away. It just makes it a little bit easier to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I think this piece of competence and helping teachers feel competent and showing them and giving them really targeted praise. And there's so much feedback and evaluations, but recognizing teachers for their unique strengths. And this is mostly from the administration end, but each of your teachers has this natural ability and or skill that makes them exceptional. And what is that skill, and how do we bolster that and help them really take pride in that ability? Because it is a village, and not every teacher is going to look the same and have the same skills, but we need each of our skills together to really support students fully. And then I also think giving teachers a space to check in with themselves. We're building a teacher version of WellCheq for that reason, so that teachers have the space to pause and also say, how am I feeling today? And kind of what do I need, and where do I feel it in my own body? And because it doesn't make the feelings go away, but when we know what we're up against, it's a little bit easier to manage them. And on the admin side, hopefully we're thinking about how to do this in the best way that's protective of teachers. But my hope is when admin sees how teachers are doing, they can find ways to support them. So maybe they can't take away that 5th class that is overwhelming, but they can be appreciative or find ways to support teachers, or even like bring in coffee or something that shows teachers like, we recognize and appreciate you. And there are tons of administrators who are already doing this, but just finding little ways to recognize and support teachers can just serve as a buffer. It doesn't make it go away, but it just makes it a little bit easier to manage sometimes.
Absolutely. And I really like what you said about administrators recognizing those unique gifts within their educators, because the role of an administrator is in part to mentor. And you really want to see maybe what's outside of the evaluation framework you're using. Maybe there is that missing piece. And I think that would be really empowering for an educator to hear their supervisor say, I really see whatever it is about them that does make them unique, their personality, their way of interacting with kids, whatever that special skill is that they bring to the school as a community, or at least to their classroom individually. Really empowering. And I really appreciate what you said too about, none of this makes the stress go away, or none of this solves the problem necessarily, but it gives you the tool, and it gives you a coping mechanism, and it gives you a way to continue to move forward. And I'm really excited for Teacher WellCheq. That is something I look forward to. Thank you so much for being here, Jodi. It has been really relaxing to talk with you. I feel less stress at the end of this conversation, and I hope our audience does as well. If listeners want to continue to hear from you and connect with you, where can they find you, and where can they find WellCheq?
Yeah, so first, thank you. I feel so grateful to be here. They can find me. My personal Twitter is Jodes, Jodes 39. And for WellCheq, we have a Twitter. It's called CheqWell, so it's actually backwards. So it's CheqWell. They can also email me at jodi@wellcheq.com, or check our website out. And I'm here to kind of offer support in any way, or answer questions, or listen to feedback, because I love working with teachers and students. And the goal is to help and create something that makes their days a little bit better.
You are an awesome servant in public education. We're really thankful for you, and we're thankful for your time today. Thanks, Jodi.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. Special thanks to my extremely knowledgeable guest today, Jodi Miller. Her research and eagerness to give generously to the world of education is inspiring. Today, we learned that SEL is an essential ingredient for student well-being and success in school, and that we can implement social-emotional learning into small moments of the day. Finally, Jodi reminded us about the importance of teacher well-being and how we all need to fill our own cups before we pour from them. Next week, I will talk with Alfonso Mendoza, technology expert and forever learner, about incorporating technology in education in the most meaningful ways. Don't miss this great conversation. If you liked what you heard, please hit subscribe and give us a rating. On Twitter, you can follow me, Natalie Conway, at AOE Natalie, and the show at SYS Presents. If you're interested in finding out more about SYS education, head to syseducation.org. Finally, this podcast wouldn't be possible without our exceptional team at SYS Education, including sound engineers Natalie Farrell and Matt Duran, and producer Bo Neal. Thanks for listening, and remember, we can do hard things.
Thanks for listening.